right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Podcast Digest, if memory serves. This is episode 159. Thank you very much for the feedback on the first ever news-based episode that Palmer and I have done. I think it went well. Palmer, what do you think?
I enjoyed it. As a first time out, I think it went swimmingly, I guess.
Well, as long as you had a good time, Palmer. That's really
I'm hoping you had a good time because you were technically I'm nothing but the potential for being your mistake.
Wow. No, I've got kids. That's not true. Well, either way, we hope you guys like that format. And if you haven't yet had a chance to shoot an email, thepodcastdigest@gmail.com, or touch base with @Agent Palmer @PodDigest on Twitter, let us know what you thought. We'd love to hear because we are going through a constant evolution right now and would love your input on how you thought that show went and how any show is going, including this one, because this one is a return to form, if you will, another classic The Podcast Digest interview show, this time featuring a very special guest, one that has sort of entered the fray, if you will. I have antenna up all the time for folks joining the world of the podcasts about podcast space, and we have a recent entrant, if you will, and what was super exciting about this entrant was that I had been a subscriber to this person's newsletter for a good long while. I think over a year at this point. That newsletter I mentioned 2 weeks ago on episode 158 called Inside Podcasting. And the host, Skye Pillsbury, has now converted it into an interview-based podcast about podcasts, which is excellent. So welcome to the Podcast Digest, Skye Pillsbury. How you doing, Skye?
Hey, I'm so happy to be here, even with my very raspy voice, which I lost over the weekend.
And so if you guys want to hear Skye's real voice, you can hear it on the Inside Podcasting podcast. We got a promo in already, Skye. How we doing?
Oh, I think it's going great. I'm feeling great about how things are going, and I'm very, very honored to be here.
Well, it's great to have you. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, it was super exciting. I always kind of think about others who kind of come in, not necessarily because I view them as competition. I mean, honestly, here at the Podcast Digest, we're a very small operation, but I am always looking maybe to kind of just chat and with a shared experience of those who are also here. Mm-hmm. And we're going to talk all about the new show, the newsletter, your background in podcasting. But to kind of start this whole thing off, as I am wont to do back in my good old interview days here in the Podcast Digest, I wanted to ask you way before Inside Podcasting, the show or the newsletter, way before podcasts were even invented, when we had a little tiny Skye Pillsbury and you were growing up, what were kind of some of your passions way back then, or what did you want to be when you grew up? What was sort of, version one of Skye way back when?
That's such an interesting question. I thought that I would be a psychologist, actually. I loved the subject in school and did very well in that, and continued that into college. And then I realized that a lot of that work is often research-based and sort of solo work, and I'm a very social person. I'm a social animal, and enjoy my alone time, but like to work with people as well. And so I decided that was not the right route for me and made a decision to go and check out marketing and public relations. And this was right when the internet was sort of becoming a real thing and the World Wide Web had been discovered. And I got a job at an agency and ended up loving that. I loved the challenge of I was working mostly with startup companies, like Yahoo, for example, before they went public. And being able to be there sort of in the ground floor and help them figure out the message that they wanted to put out into the world. And when you're working with a startup, like you're working with, the founders, and it feels very alive. And I loved that experience. And I really loved the agency that I worked for too. And so I just followed that through line, and I ended up, working in public relations for a long time, probably, how long was it? 15 years, and loved it until the end. The first 10 years, I think I really adored. And then after that point, it seemed to me like the industry had become overrun by companies that were looking to make a fast buck, or people who were looking to make a fast buck. It had felt so authentic in the early days that like people were just so enamored with this new technology and wanted to explore it. And then after a while, it became, after there were IPOs, like my client Yahoo, for example, it felt like a lot of other companies just started being born for maybe the wrong reasons. And I sort of lost my love for it and was trying to figure out what to do next. So yeah, that's sort of how things started for me. I don't know if I gave you enough information about my childhood and my early days. I'm happy to go relive any of those with you. But that was sort of that's been my career up until now. I was really looking for something that I could be passionate about again. And podcasts became that for me, which I feel so lucky to have figured that out, to have discovered a second passion in my life, which some people I feel like don't always even find their first.
Skye.
So I feel lucky.
Skye, do you feel like getting into podcasting now, you get that same energy from the startup culture when you got into marketing? Because it's still very much growing.
Yes. So absolutely. When I started listening, one of the very first podcasts I listened to was Startup. I don't know if you guys listen to that, but it was a podcast about starting a podcast empire. It was being done by Alex Bloomberg, who was in the process of trying to found Gimlet. And it spoke to me both because of my history as someone who had been working with startups almost my whole career. Because it had this very startup feel, that podcast just appealed to me because I've been there when so many companies have been getting off the ground. But then that whole world of learning about what he was trying to create and what his vision was for what podcasts could be and what his company could be. I remember thinking, if I lived in Brooklyn, I would be running down to his offices and begging him to give me a job. Really, like I was ready to be the receptionist or anything. But I couldn't figure out a real way living in California to break in. And then it was just, but I had my earbuds in my ears all the time. And I started subscribing to newsletters. And in my off hours, after I would, punch out of doing my technology public relations for the day, that I was no longer feeling really passionate about, I would just read about podcasts and listen to podcasts and sort of immerse myself in that world. And that was how I ended up getting the job at Inside Podcasting. But I feel like am I rambling here a bit?
No, you're good. You're fine. We're going to get there, though. That part, I promise.
Okay.
Hey, I did want to mention, though, when you talked about startup, I was thinking of it when you were describing it, and something just dawned on me that I don't think it's ever dawned on me before about startup, because I, too, was listening to startup and reading about this weird thing called Gimlet Media, which sounded like a super weird name back then, but sounds completely normal now.
Yeah, isn't that funny?
But something just dawned on me was it almost felt like the first ever reality podcast. Like there's reality TV. It felt like a reality podcast in the sense that you were taking along this journey. You heard like actual conversations and were kind of being brought along on this ride and this what's going to happen by the end of the season element.
Yes.
And I think more than anything, of course, the business side and Alex and his co-founder is probably not the right term. His other investor, that sort of Matt put everything out there, were characters that you're interested in. But I think more than anything else, it drew on that reality TV gene of all of ours that just wanted to know what happened next.
Yes. You're 100% right about that. And everyone became a character. Like his wife, Nazanin, became a character.
Yes.
And, everyone who Chris Sacca, the investor who he was pitching, and he did that absurd, like kind of lame pitch, but ended up getting the money anyway. I love that he put that out there, it was such an authentic moment. It was that perfect marriage of reality TV that really does seem like it's actually real, and that is hard to do, and it's hard to make yourself feel vulnerable and put that out there. I was actually interviewing Martine Powers from the Washington Post. She does their daily news podcast, and that episode's coming out this week. But anyway, I was interviewing her, and she said that without exception, the podcasts that she loves are the ones that have that authentic feel, where you know that what you're hearing, you're hearing the sighs, and you're hearing the snort laughs, and you're hearing all the stuff that, like, on regular radio or on TV, it would always be edited out. But on podcasts, we have this incredible ability to bring the listener closer in. For one thing, we're in their ears, but also really show ourselves and not be afraid of that. And that, I just love that. I love that combination.
Palmer, I think we've got our show title, Snort Laughs with Skye Pillsbury.
Now we have
Episode
to
title.
get her to, now we have to be funny.
Well, that actually came from Martine as well, because we talk about how she snort laughed in an episode once, and she wanted to cut it, but her producers wouldn't let her. They were like, no. This is like an authentic moment. You're being real. You're being Martine. Leave it in. So anyway, that's where that came from. I actually am not, I've tried to snort laugh, and I feel like I'm not like capable of doing it. Like I don't know how to do it. I'm going to disappoint you on that front. I can do other embarrassing things, but I can't snort laugh.
Before I want to ask you about other mediums. I mean, obviously podcasting is a medium that you love, but, is it music and radio? Is it, the visual mediums of television? Are we talking about text? Like, what's the other media, or before podcasting, like what was your favorite form of media?
Well, that's also an interesting question. I mean, all of my clients, almost all of them, were internet-related startups. And so I spent, in terms of just the amount of time that I was spending on things, I was using the web in 1993. I was early in those days. And so that was sort of my first love in terms of work, at least. I mean, privately, in my private life, like, I will out myself as also being a lover of downright trashy reality television. I have watched way too much Real Housewives. I mean, when I'm really just needing an escape. But I love documentaries. Like, that's probably my favorite genre. Reality TV is sort of on one end of that continuum. But whenever you'll find me, like, surfing around Netflix or Apple or whatever, I want to find, like, a really gripping, juicy documentary. Like, that's my favorite. I love music too. My husband and I are huge live music fans. We go to music festivals and drag our kids along when they're willing. And so, I feel like I'm sort of a media lover of almost all kinds, but podcast is the one kind where I felt like I must be involved with this myself. Like, I never wanted to be a rock star. I never wanted to be on stage singing. I didn't want to be on reality television. But I did want to get into the podcast world and have some little piece of it that I could own. So I guess that's what I would say. Yeah. Media lover pretty much across the board.
That's awesome. That's and I can understand what you're saying in the sense of the concept of when sort of podcasts came around for me as well, the proportionality of entertainment or leisure time spent, everything kind of shifted because I spent so much and an ever-increasing amount on podcasts that everything else kind of started to shift in terms of the time I spent on those. So.
Yeah. I'd say I was just going to say that the one thing I would add is that I love to read books, and I don't know if you consider that a medium or not, but
I do, because I consider like physical books a separate media. I'm like one of those old school guys, like give me a physical book. So
me too. I can't read on a Kindle.
It's such a separate thing because it's not a screen, so it feels so different. I could be, and you worked in public relations. I worked in marketing for like almost a decade. You're sitting on a screen all day. So when I pick up a book, like a physical book, I'm literally changing media now. Like it feels like
you are. You're changing your brain. I think your brain waves are different probably when you're reading a book. But I will say that ever since I started podcasting or working in the podcast world and becoming so obsessed with it, unfortunately, my reading time has gone down because I'm so busy. Yes. Like, oh, I got to listen to this. I'll just listen to it in bed, you know? So I miss that. I need to find out a way to carve out more time for reading, which I really, really do love.
I find it very interesting that you missed out on reading's the one that you lost. For me, it was music. I don't know how it happened, but like my reading hasn't changed, but I've noticed that I will go like days without like. I really should just turn on the radio. Like I should put down the podcast stuff for a while. Like that's the one that I missed out on somehow.
You know what? I could totally see that. And, you know, I will give credit here. I'm going to mention him again to my husband because he does not work in podcasting and he is the true music obsessive in our house. And if it wasn't for him coming home and turning on music and, you know, despite me being like, I need to listen to something, he'd be like, no. We're taking a break. We're listening to Led Zeppelin, like whatever it is. Like, you know, he is the one who keeps me connected to that world. And if I didn't have him, I'd probably be, you know, in my own time, I go to the podcast. You know, I go to the podcast over the music.
And I don't blame you. Music, it's so funny because I sort of have both of your stories in the sense that my reading time has completely disintegrated because I, like you, Skye, like you were saying, like I have no problem falling asleep to a podcast.
Me too.
Where previously I would fall asleep to reading a chapter or two of a book.
I don't know how guys can do that because I would feel like I'd miss something in the podcast.
Because you're using the wrong app, Palmer. Most good apps have sleep timers.
Yeah. But you know what? I'll even say, even when I will say that when I use the sleep timer, I invariably have to go back the next morning.
Right.
I have to rewind like 15 minutes.
Just to be sure you didn't miss it.
Yeah.
But for me, I also have effectively canceled out the music. And that's a whole nother topic. And I don't want to get into this because I've also been a mobile DJ for 20 years. And
kidding.
And I hardly ever listen to music. And my wife is constantly saying, how do these two things exist? I don't understand how you can be a DJ and you don't listen to music. And my answer is podcast. But that's a whole nother topic for another day because it's really weird. And the short story is I got into DJing because of the microphone. So I got into the DJing before podcasting were a thing because of my love for a microphone. And now that podcasting came out and came around, it became a thing. I can kind of feed that same itch here, not so much for the mobile DJing. The difference is when I do a wedding, I get paid. So that is the big difference.
Yes,
anyway,
yes,
I want to
indeed.
get back to your timeline, Skye, from that little tangent road we just went down. But I wanted to talk a little bit about, you mentioned, and I heard you talk about this in one of your interviews on the Inside Podcasting podcast. Link in the show notes, folks. Check it out. We're going to talk more about it in a moment. But you talked about how you came to be a writer for Inside Podcasting and how the newsletter formed and how that grew to be a full-time thing. But I'm curious, were in the PR roles you had before, was there a significant writing element? Was the increased amount of writing a concern, or was it a very comfortable transition for you? And how did those first kind of couple months with Inside Podcasting go?
Yeah, I love that question. So in PR, I did a ton of writing. So, whether it was writing a press release or just writing, marketing, messaging, that kind of stuff. And also, you have to be good at communicating. I mean, hopefully most people who go into that field feel pretty confident as writers. So I felt confident in that world, writing this kind of writing, which in a way is the most creative writing I've ever been able to do, because Inside.com rather, has been so generous with me in saying that I can infuse my own personality into the writing that I do. That has been new. But I've really had fun with it. Like, I love that part of it. I love it when I'm able to, my goal is to make that newsletter informative, but also, a little bit entertaining and fun to read, so people look forward to opening it. And that was a skill that it actually seemed to come pretty naturally to me when I started it. But I will say that my mother is a writer. She writes poetry, but she's just an excellent writer of anything. You ask her, I mean, if she had to write anything, she would do a great job, whether or not it was poetry. And she, during the first few months of writing the newsletter, she was so helpful to me. I would run a lot of stuff past her. Do you think this is landing right? Is this appropriate? Like, did I spell this word correctly? Like basic stuff. But also more high level. Like, she's been a writer for her whole life, so she would have really good insights for me. And so I credit her quite a bit on the beginning of that journey. And then at a certain point, I felt like, okay, I think I've got this. So it came relatively easy. I think that there was, with any new job that's really different from what you've done before, there's going to be some insecurity about, like, are people going to like me? Because if I am putting my personality into this and then people start unsubscribing, like, that's really going to suck. But luckily that didn't happen. So I have felt very invigorated by the reader feedback. It's amazing to have people who are reading your newsletter send you an email about it or tweet about it or whatever. And the minute that started happening, it gave me the confidence I needed to keep doing it, and now at this point I feel sort of this responsibility to keep doing it because people seem to enjoy it. And also because I think, quite frankly, I'm one of the only women who is writing about podcasts on the regular in a newsletter. I mean, shout outs to Sarah Larson and people like that who write for places like The New Yorker, Fiona Sturgis at Financial Times. But in terms of the newsletter world, there aren't a ton of us. So I also feel a responsibility from that perspective to keep my, to have a place where people can go and the point of view is a woman's point of view.
I want to touch on the newsletter for a moment because about 5, 6, 7 years ago, newsletters were all the rage. Mm-hmm. And then they went away. And now they're back. And but they're back in a different way. And I've never quite been able to put my finger on why they're back. Do you get a sense from, the feedback you're getting? And I guess that the asterisk to this question is podcasting as in general breeds a larger, more open community than anyone else. So I don't know if it's that maybe, but yeah.
So I do have a theory about that. I think that podcasts, especially when they were very new, but even still, and I hope that this is something that continues, has this sort of like DIY, punk rockish, safety pin it together and make it work kind of attitude. And I think that's what a lot of people love about podcasts. And I think that newsletters have that same feel, that they are, I have more latitude in what I can write because it's a newsletter. So it seems very informal. and it's not coming from the New York Times, right? Like, I can call people out on things that maybe the New York Times wouldn't let their writers do, or I can poke fun at things in a way that the New York Times might not do, because it also has this kind of like DIY feel. So I don't know whether there, maybe there are newsletters popping up in lots of industries. I can only speak to podcasting. I'll also say that at Podcast Movement in August, I was on a panel called like the podcast newsletter craze. And I was kind of like, is anyone going to show up to this? Like, we're at a podcast festival. Like,
just you and Nick Qua in a corner.
Well, he didn't show up, but it was James Cridland from Pod News, me, someone from Bellow Collective, Paul Kondo, who writes Podcast Gumbo, and Ariel Niesenblatt, who founded Earbuds Podcast Collective, moderated. And yeah, Nick Qua didn't come to the conference. We sort of chided him for that. But anyway, that's a different story.
As one should.
Yeah.
Nick is a previous guest, so I can say that.
Okay. Oh, I'll have to listen to that interview. Anyway, so it was like standing room only. Like, people were totally there, and they were interested and asking great questions, and it was a really invigorating session. And after it was over, those people that I just mentioned who I was on stage with, we were all like, oh my God, we have to do this again. Like, that felt like really useful to people. And they seemed really engaged. And so people are into it. I mean, it surprises me too, but people have passion about it.
And it's super interesting to me, and I think Palmer's Crescent's great because I have now subscribed to many, many newsletters, and I think one of the reasons for the reinvigoration, first of all, I am a super tech geek. My listeners know this already, and one of the reasons is that websites have been degraded in their value, and the biggest reason is ad blocking, right? And the over-proliferation of advertising on websites and things of that nature. A lot of people are now, blacklisting sites and blocking ads, and a lot of sources, especially news sources, are figuring out ways to try to reach their audience without their ads getting nixed. And one of the easiest ways of doing that is a newsletter. So you go to CNN.com. If you even drag your mouse towards the X, you get a pop-up, sign up for the top 5 items every morning in your inbox.
It's so annoying.
It's everywhere now.
Yeah.
So you got to kind of curtail that. And the other thing is that we're in an on-demand world, right? And I think that's one of the reasons you had that experience, Skye, with the podcasting newsletters, is that podcasting is completely on demand. You know, everyone always talks about Netflix for podcasts. Well, podcasts were Netflix before Netflix was, in the sense that here's a whole catalog, pick what you want to listen to.
That's such a good point. Yeah.
And so in newsletters sort of fit that format in the context of sign up for the information you'd like and get it auto sent to you, right? You don't have to go out and get it anymore. It just drops in your inbox. It's sort of, I'm a minority user of the Castro iOS podcast app, but they use an inbox triage format, kind of similar in the sense that new episodes get dropped in the inbox and you can listen from there. And it sort of follows that newsletter template or approach to listening, if you will. But Inside Podcasting, that newsletter, I'm curious about how you went from a world of writing newsletters to starting a show and joining the team that you ultimately had covered for so long. So if you could kind of respond to this in 2 ways. One, I want to talk a little bit more about Inside, because I went through your footer on a recent newsletter, and only to find out that there are 3,000 Inside newsletters, including one on deals that I signed up for.
Oh, good.
So that's one. If you could tell folks a little bit more about Inside in general and how that world sort of allowed you to create a podcast.
Yeah, well, so just in terms of Inside, we have, I think, 3,000. I love that you're saying 3,000. I think it's more like 50.
There you go. Thereabouts.
But people are always surprised to learn. Like, there's Inside Trump, there's Inside Beer, there's Inside pretty much, most major cities. I shouldn't say most, but a lot of major cities. And virtually on like any topic that we think people are interested in, if we get enough people who express interest on our website for a certain topic, we'll find a writer to write that newsletter because we can see that we're we could be meeting a demand. So it's been successful. They're advertiser supported. I think that, Jason Calacanis, who founded it, really feels like he's hit upon something that makes sense to people. The company has gone through a few different pivots prior to doing newsletters. And Jason, if you talk to him, will say, we realized that, doing old-fashioned email was going to be the way that people were going to engage the most. And I think he feels really good about how it's going. Does that answer your question about Inside, or did you want me to say anything else?
No, absolutely.
Okay.
That's great. I just wanted to flesh that out to let folks know that we're talking about a broader world than podcasting.
Yeah, that's right. And so you asked about how I was able to start a podcast. Right. So it actually came about because Jason Calacanis, who is an angel investor, runs 2 podcasts of his own. One is called This Week in Startups and one is called Angel. And they're both about like the things that he's passionate about, entrepreneurialism and angel investing and getting companies off the ground and that kind of thing. And he had me guest on one of his episodes for This Week in Startups. He was doing sort of like a end of the year wrap up about, how we think what do we think is interesting on the landscape these days? And so he had me guest and talk about podcasting and what did I think was new and what would be coming up that next year. This was like in December of last year. And so I knew because of that he has a beautiful studio. All of the writers work remotely. But he has an office in San Francisco. And so I live right across the Golden Gate Bridge. So I drove in, went to his studio, kind of in the back of my mind was like, oh, there's this studio here, like not being used some of the time. And so I just ran it past not Jason, but someone who was very close to Jason. And I sort of said, wouldn't this kind of be cool, like to do a podcast about, I didn't know what I was doing. Like I have no experience, etc. But he was like, I think that's a great idea. And within 24 hours, Jason was like, we got to do this. And it kind of just took off from there, which was a little bit terrifying. Actually, a lot terrifying, but also very exciting. Like the fact that I was sort of being given this ability and sort of like make it what you want and you figure it out and go. There's 2 sides of that. It's I was nervous-sided, as my kids say. My kids made up the word nervous-sided, which is obviously a blend between nervous and excited. But it's really gone, like it's been such an incredible learning curve for me. I've learned a ton and I've enjoyed every minute of it. So I feel blessed that I was given that opportunity.
Do you, this came up on one of your episodes already of Inside Podcasting, but are you comfortable now to call yourself a podcaster? And if not now, how much longer do you think it'll take?
I think I'm there. So when I had that conversation that you're referring to, that was with Kim, my managing editor, and when we were recording that, I did not feel like a podcaster because all of the work that I had done still felt like this like secret because we hadn't released any of it yet and I didn't know what the response would be. And, you're just on the brink of like really putting yourself out there. Like I think a lot of podcasters can probably relate to the idea of like, it's freaking scary when you get to that moment where you're like, okay, like this episode is done. Like we're going to put it out into the world. And you feel like I still have some imposter syndrome. I still do. But I feel like I've been welcomed by people that, again, like the listeners, once you have listeners who are responding to you, sending you emails who are not your family members, it starts to feel real. So I would say at this point, I feel like a podcaster. I feel like a baby podcaster. Like I'm definitely like still feel new and I'm still learning so much. And I think at the end of this season, we're just doing a 6-episode season. Well, 6 podcaster interviews. And then I'm going to take a month to, first of all, listen to more podcasts because this has sort of taken over my life, and listen to some podcasts, look back at like, what do I think really worked? What didn't? Are there changes we should make? I know I want to have a more diverse group to talk to in our next season. We did have some, but I felt like it wasn't enough. I wanted to get a more diversity of voices. So that's something I'm definitely going to be focused on for season 2. But in general, sort of take stock of the experience and find out, like, I'm also going to be asking the listeners, like, we've been doing these behind the scenes episodes that are really short. They're like 5 minutes after every interview. Like, are those interesting to people? Like, are they digging it? Like, the downloads are decent, but like, you never know just if someone's downloaded it, did they enjoy it, So I want to know, I want to find that out. Before we go to season 2. I'm really looking forward to having a break. I will say that. Like, it's a lot. I mean, I want to ask you guys, like, is your plan now that you're sort of starting this journey, are you going to take breaks, or are you going to just like, now you're just going?
Well, and it's funny that you asked that, because that was sort of something I was going to ask you as well in terms of the decision of series versus ongoing. That is something that, when I started the show back in 2015, seasons were not necessarily a thing you saw often in 2015. There were a few back then that those things existed. Now it's much more in the ether that is very common in the culture that folks set up things as seasons. And I feel 2 ways about this. During the core run of the Podcast Digest, I was very, very proud of the fact that I put out a brand new episode once a week for 3 years consecutively.
Wow.
For this show. That said, it was also part of the reason that put us on hiatus
yeah.
for almost a year, because it was exhausting in the sense that as you may or may not already have fully grasped already, booking is arguably the most difficult aspect of an interview-based show. Finding the right guests, coordinating calendars and schedules and the technical elements of remote interviewing with guests are all go into an overhead that the listener likely never will see. And it all can be that much more. And I have thought in the past that, especially as we approached this relaunch of, maybe I do kind of bank them and do them all sort of how you have done with your first season of Inside Podcasting, kind of aggregate the end result, clean them up, make them nice, make them beautiful, and then release them on a regular schedule from there.
Yeah.
I have thought about that. But I've decided that, at least for now, especially because I decided that in conjunction with my brand new co-host Palmer, that we were going to cover news in the non-interview episodes, like last week, 2 weeks ago show.
Yeah,
That banking wasn't relevant anymore, because if you're going to be newsy, you've got to talk and release.
Yeah.
And so that kind of married us into the idea of not banking. But it is an interesting concept, because there are sort of 2 ways of going about this, right? You have tons of examples, Inside Podcasting being one, but many, many others that adopt the season format of a release schedule, a bulk, and then usually a break period, and then a next season, and so on and so forth. But that contrasts against, especially I have to point out, a lot of legacy shows. I'm thinking of the Marins of the world,
right,
where, yes, there's an advance recording per se, but it is a continual flow. So for you guys, when you were deciding on this, was it only because it was sort of a test, or is that familiarity? And have you any thoughts about how things may look moving forward?
Yeah. So we did the 6-episode season. I think initially our idea was kind of like, let's test this out and see what it's like. And I'm sure Jason wanted to see if I sucked as an interviewer. You know, he didn't know how I was going to perform. And but that felt really good to me to have, you know, to just, okay, 6 episodes, you know, and then sort of take stock. But I think that it has, you know, we're definitely going to keep doing it. We haven't. Actually, let me go back to one thing. You mentioned, you know, sort of batching them, like interviewing and then doing the editing and then getting them all ready and putting them out. And that part was my doing. Like, I think that Jason would have been happy with me doing what he does, which is just shoot the breeze for, you know, in his case, like an hour and a half. And then those episodes go out like a day later. I felt that as someone who my audience did not really know, and I haven't been doing this for a long time, and I'm not a celebrity, that I wanted to be sure that every minute that they listened to was interesting. I mean, part of that might have been my own insecurity, but I just thought, like, I don't think that people want to hear me talk for an hour and a half. Like, I think that maybe that we just want to get to the good parts. So that's why I decided that I wanted to be able to go back and edit and really just put the parts that I loved the most into the episode. I mean, a lot of those episodes, I've talked to that person for an hour and a half, and then we've edited it down, which, by the way, I will not ever do that again. Like, that was a rookie mistake because I thought, oh, I'll have all this great tape to choose from, and instead it just sets up an editing nightmare when you have 80 minutes to cull through. So I won't be doing that again. That was one of my learnings. But you know, in the end, I'm happy with the end result for this season. I think I am more comfortable with knowing what I want to get from the interview now. Like, I think I've sort of like figured out what I'm really going for, which you're learning in real time when you're doing a podcast, as I'm sure you can probably remember in your earlier days. So I think that I can be more successful at interviewing someone for a shorter time, but getting the interview I want. So I feel more comfortable about that. So hopefully there'll be less edited and less stuff that I feel I need to edit going forward. In terms of the next season, I haven't actually spoken with Jason about how many episodes it will be, or, you know, you do hear like the consistency is really important if you want to have a great podcast, but I just know that it's so time consuming and it's so draining that I don't think I can do this without breaks. Like, I think that I will need breaks. So I think that we will probably continue to do a seasonal format. That's what I would argue for. And if I lose some subscribers because of that, well, in my mind, then maybe they're just not digging what I'm selling, and that's okay. You know, I think people who really love the show hopefully will stick around and wait for more of it. So that's my comfort level right now. Maybe someday this will feel so much easier that I'll be able to do what you're doing and like record and put it out on a continuous basis, but I'm just not quite there yet.
I want to comment on what Dan did for 3 years is spectacular.
Yeah.
And I feel like one of the reasons that this relaunch is going to succeed, or early, but is because what Dan learned, and I've learned it too. I've been behind the scenes producing a ton of other shows, is now we're doing it every other week. And we're giving ourselves this break. And while it is continuous, and Dan can speak to this from experience, and I can to a certain extent, the difference between every week and every other week in podcasting is literally night and day.
Huge.
But I did want to ask you mentioned editing. To what level is the show edited? I mean, obviously the one you edited down was edited a lot, but and is that you? And what kind of direction do you give whoever edits it if it's not you?
Yeah. So I have a producer who helps me with the editing. Shout out to Michael Sorg. And He is great, but I give him a lot of direction. So what happens is, and that's not because he's not capable, it's because I'm a control freak. So he gives me, or rather, so I record in the studio, as I mentioned before. I have a sound engineer there who works for Jason, but he's been kind enough to be my sound engineer as well. He sends me the raw, unedited tape. I listen back to the whole thing. Most of my interviews this season were an hour and a half, so they're all very edited. For the final product, he sends me the tape. I listen to it and I do a paper edit. Like I write down everything that I think we can cut. A lot of detail on like, I think this could go here, there. Like it takes me a really long time. I have a very basic knowledge of editing software. I actually did take a course once, but I knew that it would just take me forever to do it myself and that it would probably be worth hiring someone who really knows what they're doing. So I send that to Mike. He does the first edit and then we sort of go back and forth. Like by the time it gets back to me, it's edited down quite a bit, but I usually have more changes and in some cases even more changes after that until we get to the final product. And in one interview, the first one I ever did, which was with Madeline Barron, it was my first interview and I asked such long questions. Oh my God. I like went on and it was like, Skye, shut the F up. So in that one interview, I didn't do this for any of the others. I actually went back into the studio and re-recorded some of my questions because I just felt like the listener is going to get so bored of my voice. So I did that for that episode and those got sent over to Mike and he reinserted them. But for the most part, it's definitely a joint effort between Mike and I. So I'm hoping for Mike's sake and mine that next season neither of us will have to work quite as hard on the editing front.
Editing is probably beyond scheduling. Editing's probably the number one time suck.
Well, don't you also think that prep is a time suck? I mean, what kind of prep are you guys doing? Yes. Do you have a secret? Because I am spending an absurd amount of time prepping for these interviews.
So I can speak as the new guy. I've done. I've been a co-host a lot, which means I really get to like just sit in the best seat in the house. Like, listen, if anybody's out there listening, like being a podcaster is great. Being a podcast co-host, where you're literally second fiddle, the best job ever. No, because Dan and I are trying this a little more equal. So I'm not just like you do all the work, Dan. But I've been in scenarios and shows where I've been able to be like just the Ed McMahon, and it's fantastic. But for this, like you learn as you go. It's kind of like the rest of podcasting. I don't know if there is one secret to asking a more truncated question or knowing how to transition from what you just said to where I want you to go or preparing. It's just a matter of you learn by doing, basically, and you get better the more you do it, the more reps you put in.
Yeah.
And I think in terms of prep, as you know, back when I was flying solo, much as you are now in terms of sitting in the host chair, Skye, I've kind of evolved on that, right? I'm a big tech guy. I have an iPad. I have an app called Notability that I would take all my notes in and would literally sit here with my iPad in front of me. And these notes would get into pages and pages prior to an interview, a scheduled interview with the guest. I mean, I generally speaking, the bigger the guest, right, and the larger volume of body of work that they have available that I feel now obligated to review and familiarize myself with, the larger the prep session and notes would go. I mean, I remember, you know, one of the biggest names I've been very, very fortunate to talk to was Roman Mars, of course, from 99% Invisible and Radiotopia.
Yeah.
And the prep I put in for that was extraordinary. I mean, we're talking probably 15 to 20 hours of reading / note-taking / YouTube video watching of other interviews he had done, because I wanted to try to find some kind of sliver of territory that somebody hadn't gone before. And whether I'll leave it up to everybody else on whether I was successful or not in doing that. But I found that my prep kind of mirrored that. With those exceptions, which I would consider as kind of like your 5-star guess, with those exceptions, my prep kind of evolved into a much more, if I listened to the host a lot, then I did very basic prep in the sense that I was really familiar with their back catalog just as a listener, and I had kind of already flexed the interview muscles enough to kind of know where I generally want to go and what I'd like to evoke and what I'd like to cover. And so there were actually probably 15 to 20 episodes I actually did no prep. In the sense that I felt
I'm so
pretty
jealous.
comfortable. But I'm telling you, it took me years to get to that phase.
Yeah.
And it was only because somebody had put out 200 episodes of their show and I'd been a listener since day one. Kind of like hearkening back to what you were talking about earlier. I think it was in your conversation with Jessie Hemphill on episode 2 of Inside Podcasting, where she was telling the story about Manoush Zomorodi, previous guest on the Podcast Digest, who had, she felt as if she knew them.
Yeah.
So if you feel as if you know your guest already, you'll find that the prep element won't be near as much.
Yeah, I'm sure that you're right. I think what has this first season, I've felt like even if I know their podcast, I've just felt like I have to know everything I can find about them, even beyond that, because it's like, as a new podcaster, as a new interviewer, it's like, it feels kind of like your security blanket. Like, well, I've done all my prep and I've got all this information. And so, I can control that. And so, or at least you feel that gives you some control. Whether it does in the interview is who knows. But I feel like you're right. Like if you know someone's body of work and you've been a loyal listener, that it's half the battle. And then and I actually think that there is something to not over prepping and trying to have more surprise and more conversations that you weren't expecting in an interview. So you have to sort of figure out what the line is between those two things. And I guess I'm still figuring out that line.
Skye, you mentioned the mini episodes. Whose idea was that? And, where did the format for them come from? Because obviously you've got quote unquote cutting room floor material. Like you didn't have to talk about it. You could just be like, here's some things that didn't make it into, so.
Yeah, you know what? So the idea for doing it came from me, although Jason might take credit for that too. I feel like we both had the same thought. And so it's murky about who came up with it first. But my idea was that we just do it at the end of the episode. Like, okay, now you've listened to this, like now this is like the equivalent of the after the final rose for The Bachelor. Like we're going to talk about how that all went, the backstory. And he wanted to do it separately. I think he's probably, to be honest, thinking about like if we do have advertising in a subsequent season, that obviously having a separate episode that drops gives you more opportunities for that. But I've actually liked having it separate myself because, selfishly, it gives me an opportunity to sort of remind people that we're here, have it pop up on their, podcatcher one more time and remind them to listen to the original episode. But I love stuff like that. I personally love anything that is behind the scenes. And I think that a lot of podcasts who do that and do it successfully end up being some of my favorites because you just get to pull back the curtain. And it's the same reason why I love documentaries. You want to go behind and see what really happened and all that. And I'm just a curious person. So I did that because I thought that was what I would want to hear. But I would love listener feedback on that. Yeah, so that's where the idea came from. I feel like you asked me another question that I'm not answering, that I'm forgetting.
Well, the only other part of it was you've got all this extra cutting room floor material
Right.
that didn't make the main show. Why not just do that as the behind the scenes?
Yeah, that was honestly just feeling exhausted. And that would have required more work, to be perfectly honest. Like, go back and figure out, like, what would we play that would kind of make sense. We did earmark some stuff to go into a blooper reel, which I think I think we're going to release like a blooper episode. I'm not 100% on that, but I think it's going to happen. And so Mike did make some like marks. I think like this is good for the blooper reel. We were in one case, and I unfortunately can't go into the details of this, but I can't give you the total scoop. But in one of my interviews, we talked a lot about something that was not podcast focused. It was about something really different. And I wanted to run it as a bonus episode, but the podcaster wasn't comfortable with that for reasons that have to do with his personal life. And so we ended up running a few snippets of it that he was comfortable with in the episode, but we didn't end up running it as a separate episode. That was one of the things I was thinking of doing that we would do like an off season. But maybe, it's something that we could consider. We could go back, not for that particular example, but in other discussions. Like Martine and I had this really interesting discussion about what was going to transom like, what was her earlier life like, how she feels connected to where her parents came from. Like those might be interesting to run. But again, it would require work. So it's sort of like, I think we're all feeling like after this season is done, we need to collapse for a little while and do some more listening to other stuff. So maybe we'll end up doing that. I think it's a good idea. I do. But I just don't know if it's practical right now for how we're all feeling.
No, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I know Palmer and I are subscribed, so we'll be ready and waiting for whatever comes in that feed in the future after the 6th. Well, Skye, I want to wrap up with one more question for you, and I want to thank you for your time this evening. Very much appreciated. Talking Shop and the new Inside Podcasting show. Link in the show notes again, folks. And that's this. I was thinking about, I mentioned earlier that I have been subscribed to any number of podcast newsletters, yours, Nick Quall with Hot Pod. And I was Googling and thinking about another one actually that you didn't mention was at the show. And I realized as I Googled her and found out she's actually been gone since April. And I hope she comes back. Sarah Weber was doing a podcast newsletter for a good long while that was delivered in my mailbox.
Oh, what was it called?
Week. I'm not even sure. She was calling it Sarah's Podcast Newsletter. If you Google Sarah Weber, Weber, and that, she was doing a lot of great stuff, and followed her on Twitter and so on and so forth. But what I noticed up until recently with your launch of the Inside Podcasting podcast is that all of these hosts, creators, authors of these newsletters rarely, if ever, and folks, don't at me. I know there's an exception to this statement I'm about to make, I'm sure, but rarely actually did launch their own show, you being obviously the exception to that statement. And so I'm curious, as you continue both of these efforts, obviously I'm assuming that the newsletter isn't going anywhere in terms of your authorship, and like you already mentioned, we are going to be looking at a season 2 of the show at some point as well. But now, having stepped behind the microphone and gone through a lot of the things we've been talking about, has one now influenced the other to a degree that was a bit surprising, in the sense that, are you now issuing newsletters and writing content for that with a different eye and view than maybe you did previously, or vice versa? Do you think that your new podcaster experience was a little bit different because of your familiarity with the industry as a whole?
So I would say that writing the newsletter didn't really help me in putting together a podcast. But like writing about it is so different than doing it. So in that way, it didn't influence it because it didn't. I mean, it gave me certain ideas about things that I knew I wanted to do, but it didn't help inform because they really are so different, right? Like the content is really different. Like I'm not talking about, I had some people email me and say, why aren't you going to do a podcast about like news? Like that's what you write about. Why don't do a podcast about that? And my response to that was, I do that all week. Like I want to have a break from that. Like I want to do something completely different. And also, I'm super passionate about podcasts and I'm super passionate about the people who make them. I'm sort of in awe of people who make incredible podcasts. And selfishly, I wanted to make a podcast that like I would want to listen to and that played on my own passions. And I think as a podcast host, if you're not doing a podcast about something that you care about, it's going to show. And I just didn't feel at that time, maybe at some point I could do that. But right now, what I really want to do is something different than in the newsletter. I also wouldn't say that I'm writing the newsletter any differently, with the exception that sometimes when I read articles now about how a podcast is put together, I understand it better. And so I can make commentary that I might not have been able to make before having the actual firsthand experience of making one. But they do feel still like very separate animals. Even though it's under the same brand, it feels like I'm using a completely different part of my brain when I'm working on the podcast than when I'm writing the newsletter. So in that way, they feel actually very, very separate to me.
It's going to be interesting to see how that progresses. I would love to ask you this question after season 6 of Inside. And the reason I say that is I still think, especially from listening to episodes, that you still have this outsider, newbie, still figuring out how to do this mentality.
Yeah.
But I wonder, as that all evolve, erodes, and you're like, no, I'm a podcaster. Here's my show. Here's my back catalog. This is what I do. But if you continue to write about it, I wonder how you will look at some of these stories and tales and big news items that come across now from a slightly different perspective as opposed to an observer and a commentator, now as more sort of one of us or brethren type.
Right. Oh, I love that you're saying, like, suggesting that I'm one of you all. And
season 6, you got to get to 6 first.
Yeah, right. I still have a long road to go. But it may change. You're right. It may evolve. I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, I already feel like so much within me has sort of shifted since I've started doing it. I have this additional knowledge that I didn't have before, but whether I'm able to whether that's going to translate to my writing will be interesting to see. I don't know either.
Yeah.
I'll check in with myself after season 6 and find out.
And folks, you need to be along for this ride as well. So Inside Podcasting, the newsletter, sign up. It's free. It's awesome. How many times a week, Skye?
It used to be 5 before we did the podcast. Wow. And then we actually pared down to 3, so I'm writing it 3 times a week. And we actually did recently this survey of our readers to find out, was that a problem, or did they want it even less or more? And people were like, not everyone, but a lot of people said, I think I read it more now that it's coming less, because it's right. 5 days a week is a lot to read in your inbox. So I think for now we're going to keep it at 3, which is great for me. It gives me, as I said, the break that I need.
And if somebody wants to sign up for this, they go to
inside.com/podcasting.
And if they want to hear the maiden season of Inside Podcasting, the podcast, how can they do that?
It's called Inside Podcasting. It has my dorky picture on the podcast art, which was not my idea, by the way, but I'm going with it. At first, the art was a orange and white square, but that has now shifted to a picture of me. And you can find it wherever you find podcasts. We are pretty much everywhere. I mean, Google, Apple, Spotify, Castbox, Overcast, anywhere you listen, it should show up, except for we're still waiting for Pandora. and we're waiting for iHeartMedia. But I think those should come in pretty soon.
They'll get there soon, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Palmer, anything we didn't cover with Skye?
There was only one question, and I don't know if you don't want to answer it now, because obviously you haven't released all 6 episodes yet. Mm-hmm. But I was wondering if there was one common theme, whether it made it on air or not, that surprised you in talking to these 6 different people.
So I think there's a couple things in my mind right now. One common theme, for sure, which maybe wouldn't have surprised me until I started making one of my own, but now it doesn't surprise me, is just how hard the work is and how it's a work of passion and blood, sweat, and tears. And I think listeners, when you're a casual listener, you don't understand that. Like, you're not thinking about, like, oh, the music and the intro and especially in podcasts that are highly edited, like narrative podcasts, like that's a whole separate beast of like figuring out the structure and how is this going to make sense? And is it going to sound right? And the need to get other people to listen and tell you is what you're hearing because you've been so close to it, because it's this passion, blood, sweat, and tears project for you. Does this sound right? Like when you've been listening to something for so long, it's hard to tell. And I loved what Ian Chillock said, Everything is Alive, where he said, this is a hard, dumb business. Because in a way, like that just sums up, like we love it. There's no reason to do it unless you're passionate about it. And in the end, it's a hard, dumb business. It's hard. And sometimes it feels dumb that you're working that hard on something. But everyone who's doing it loves it, or else they wouldn't. So that was a theme that definitely came through.
And it's one I would definitely echo. The Podcast Digest, folks may have already heard me talk about, is a little more live to tape. That said, it is certainly harder than I think most people would realize. That element, that statement, I would definitely back. I am not heavy on editing, but it is sort of a labor of love. Nobody here, at least, is retiring anytime soon from these efforts, but we do it because we
love it. I will just say I had a podcast host that I was interviewed by a few weeks ago. She asked me if I think that people get into podcasting to have like more work-life balance because you can do podcasting from your home or whatever. And I was like, no one gets into this business for work-life balance. Like, who are you kidding? Like, this is the opposite of work-life balance. And you're certainly not, most people aren't getting paid that much for work-life to make even sense to, even if it was work-life balance. So yeah, I thought that was really funny.
That is absolutely hilarious. I agree with you there, Skye, for sure. Well, Skye Pillsbury, thank you very much for joining us here on the Podcast Digest. It was a pleasure to speak with you, and we are enjoying the show so far. And as of the time of this recording, we are halfway through the season 1 releases, folks. So link in the show notes to sign up, to subscribe and sign up for the newsletter of Inside Podcasting. So, Skye, thanks again.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm going to go back and listen to your interview with Roman Mars and a few others that you mentioned. I think you're doing great work too. And I'm so thankful that those of us who are in this sort of same sphere, that it's a friendly thing. I feel that way with my fellow newsletter writers too. Like, there's room for everyone, and I love that you had me on the show, and I hope we stay in close touch.
Absolutely. I would very much enjoy that, and I'm looking forward to the future season 6, the season 6 check-in and the return to the Podcast Digest of Skye Pillsbury.
Yes,
when we ask
hopefully
that
I make it there alive.
So,
thank you again.
Thank you very much for joining us. So, Palmer, thanks again.
Hey, you know what? As long as you'll have me, I'll keep showing up.
Sounds like great. We're going to cover some news again soon. Folks, for the Podcast Digest, for Agent Palmer, check him out at Agent Palmer and myself at at Pod Digest, or email the show, thepodcastdigest at gmail.com. If you got thoughts, suggestions, ideas, or feedback, we want to hear it. And until next time, folks, that's it for the Podcast Digest.